so walk through vein mogra. So walk through Gale.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Ballina Fringe Festival's online tour of the art and architecture of the Ice House Hotel. The Ice House is the key corporate sponsor of the festival, and as always we really appreciate their support. The hotel is a major supporter of the arts in Ballina and also has a rich collection of artistic treasures with works by leading Irish artists like Gale and Tyrell adorning the walls alongside works by local artists. So we are going to get a glimpse into the art, architecture and history of this jewel in the crown of North Mayo.
In its old days, in its formative days, the Ice House was the centre of the Moy Fishery Company. And the Moy Fishery Company managed the waters of the Moy, the fishing rights, and up to 30, 40, 50,000 salmon a year were caught here. It was a tremendous part of the town. The fishery company employed 1,500 people at one time. That was an enormous amount of people, an enormous amount of factories in today's terms. And below us here on the river, you have the Crete Boom, the concrete ship which came from Farrell and Furness in England. In the 1930s, it was brought in to ease traffic in and out of the quay here to stop the river from silting up to allow the ships in and out. Believe it or not, the Crete Boom was one of 18 built in Farrell and Furness during the First World War, and she saw service in the Baltic. The shipping was a very important part of the commercial life of Ballina. They brought in ice from Norway and Scandinavia when the ice here wasn't sufficient to keep the ice house supplied. And you had traffic going out, cattle, sheep, farm produce. Even during the famine, when people were protesting about food being exported, it was being exported through the quay here. How many people lived in the Ice House? Not many. The little family, they were Scottish, and they would have lived there with their servants, maybe 9, 10, 11. People, of course, worked downstairs. People boxing salmon, looking after the salmon, getting them ready for export. Because remember, these salmon were on the London fish market the next morning, out through rail, a very confined system that they had to meet every day to get stuff out of here at 4 o'clock to be in the London fish market the next morning. The catches were enormous. They used to have staked nets on the river down there. And in 1 hour, they pulled up 5,000 salmon. And these were boxed, crated, shipped back over to London, trains and that.
Okay, so this obviously is the original ice house. It's a protected structure. It was a working ice house up until the middle of the 20th century, and then it fell into disrepair. But you can think of it almost as a hinge, and from that hinge, 2 long arms sort of radiate. This is one of them here, which we call the spa wing. And this was really a discovered site. It didn't really exist until we looked at the lease maps and we discovered that our red line, our property line, was in quite a bit. So we took away the bank and built the spa wing and then reinstated part of the car park on top of it. So this is the second wing that radiates from the original house, and this is where most of the bedrooms are located. And what was good here is we were able to use the dramatic change in level between street level and river level, so that on the street side the building is just over a story high, but on the river side it's a full 3 stories high. And that allowed us to get that efficiency of use. So this is the bedroom block, and this was sort of really conceived as a sculptural element, as a counterpoint to the original house. The stone pattern is inspired by the rock formations we find in the west of Ireland, like the Cliffs of Moher and the Burren. And architects are always looking for patterns and for geometry, and the rock formations over here are extremely geometric. All of the hotel rooms face west, so they face the Leek Forest and the estuary. So therefore the design decision was very simple, how to design these rooms. Just put a big window on the gable wall, so when you walk into the room you see the beautiful forest and you see the beautiful estuary, and nothing else is really needed. Even the bed is positioned so that it's looking out the windows. So this is the main dining space that was added on to the original house when we were doing the work. It faces west. We get the evening sun whenever the sun decides to shine in County Mayo. And this links in to what was the ice chamber, where the ice was stored, originally 2 rooms. And this end arch, of course, would have been closed in to keep the ice cold And we opened that up as part of the works so that the two dining areas were linked. And this arch over here, this is where the ice was brought in, and the cart would be reversed in, and the ice would be dumped down into what was this huge vault. And there it would stay for 3 or 4 months, and would, from maybe spring till late summer, would remain cold and remain frozen.
So Pierce, I've been around the hotel, absolutely stunning. I feel like this fusion of old and new, the kind of Victorian with the modern contemporary. It's like you kind of drop into pockets of different time periods, quite a dramatic way. Can you tell me about the process of coming across the hotel, purchasing it, designing it, the whole thing?
Essentially, this was a house that was nearly falling into the river. So having sat down with the architect, Joe Kennedy, he came up with an outstanding structure for building a very ambitious hotel. It was important that, from my point of view, that there would be an artistic connection some way or other. So from that perspective, I spoke to Joe and a fellow called Roland Mahon, who is a very good friend of ours, who was very helpful in curating initially the artwork. He identified a number of his contemporaries, Martin Gale, Charles Tyrell and John Devlin. And we would have then, in that context, commissioned the paintings that you've seen and that you would review later on. What's important to us is they do provide that connection between the art world and the public. And we're extremely proud of that, in the same way that the old building does the same thing. You take an art gallery, and art galleries are great, and museums are great, and they're fantastic places. But they're almost kind of, you go to them for the purpose of seeing the art, right? You come to this place because it's an amenity. You're coming to relax. It's a leisure type activity, but you're living with the art while you're here. And to my mind, it's a lot more real.
In a hotel, it's kind of about escape. It's about, as you say, leisure, and they're in a different kind of time zone, a different feel. So I think it does allow for a different kind of experience of the artwork.
I think our purpose would be to continue with the collection and to continue investing in the arts. Yeah. And in commissioning the artwork, it was very important that we had a team, and we had Roisin Hogan, Ro Mahan and Joe Kennedy, who selected and worked with the artist, and were particularly important in terms of the rooms, and each individual room has its own unique painting and print, and again they went to great efforts to compile those and put them together, and they're quite special.
It's a total pleasure to be here with you both and to have met you earlier, and this beautiful surroundings of Ice House Hotel. And it would be great to talk, I think, to start with, about the process of being involved in this project. I think it's really amazing that you were invited here at the time, before, while it was being built, so it was completely embedded within the framework of the project.
Yeah. Well, we got the call, and it sounded really interesting, and it was remarkable because we came at a very early stage. It was a building site, so Pierce had the idea of bringing a troupe together of people interested and involved, who will be involved in the building and the project, and ourselves as artists, myself, Martin, and of course Johnny Devlin. And yes, we had a number of outings here, and a lot of it was social, and a lot of it was kind of a bonding thing, and it was good fun. But it was really getting a sense of the project and the building and the place.
Yeah, and I think it went back. It went back to when we were at art college, because Pierce's Roe, who's a friend of Pierce, was involved in the project, and he was at art school at the same time as we were. So we knew each other from that back, 50 years now, and he knew what to expect from us, I guess, and it was just a great project to be involved in. As Charlie said, we were here from the very outset.
And so the works that are shown here, were some of them existing or site-specific, commissioned for here?
Well, in my case, they were part of something I was doing anyway, because I'd been coming up here since about 2000 to a place called Ballycastle, Ballinglen Arts Foundation up there. So I was kind of engaged with the area with the kind of landscape, because my paintings are landscape based, and there's more going on besides that. But and so I was already tied into the area, so it was perfect, you know, when this opportunity came to do this. And I already had done, I suppose, the groundwork in the sense that I got to know the area. So, and I felt that I could bring some of what was here into the ice house, you know, without it being, you know, illustrative of the area. I was very taken with this concrete boat, which is sitting in the middle of the estuary. I believe it's called a crate boon. I think it's called for the concrete boat. And the idea of a concrete boat is so incongruous that it was fascinating. So we have that, and then we have a boat. I mean, you know, a boat which you would expect to float there. I don't know the story behind the boat. I don't know how it came to be there, but presumably it floated at one point.
Totally. How about yourself?
I wouldn't do sort of site-specific too much or kind of thematic or, you know, whatever. Yeah, they're very much just off that moment in time. But knowing the building and knowing the kind of what was coming into a kind of an interesting modernist mix building. Yeah. I knew they'd work here.
That's an interesting point, because the building is there's modernist and there's traditional, and you could say the same for the paintings actually. They might work in Johnny's stuff is fairly traditional compared to you know where yours is more modernist. So that kind of mix runs through the building and it runs through the work.
And both of your works seem to speak of the organic and nature, but in very different ways. Yeah. But that also feels like it would be sympathetic with the surroundings and the environment here.
Yes. Well, of course, I have a completely different relationship with landscape than Martin has. I'd say Johnny probably doesn't have a relationship with landscape. Interestingly, at all, I can't imagine.
I remember standing outside a bar with Johnny in Pierce Street, and there was a row of motorbikes. It was a biker's bar, and there was a row of motorbikes outside, and Johnny said, "No, that's an Irish landscape." So that's it.
It feels like, in some ways, looking at particularly both your work, that yours kind of looks at nature that's been honed by humanity, and that's kind of controlled or nurtured through farming or
what interests me in regards to landscape is the way people interact with it, and the way people affect landscape and the way landscape affects people. So when this area is particularly interesting because it goes right back to the Neolithic times. There's Neolithic farm sites out towards the Cage of Fields, which is 20 miles from here. And you know, and the landscape has affected the people, and people have affected the landscape, and they interact. And that's the area that I'm interested in. You know, I don't paint scenery. You know, it's always about something else. The landscape happens to be the kind of arena where the thing is set. You know.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned previously that that's kind of similar. Like, it was something great you said, that you don't go looking for the landscape finds you.
Yeah. Well, I've always had this sort of, I won't say love-hate, but a kind of an odd relationship with landscape. I was, from the beginning, because embracing abstraction, I was sort of adamant that I wasn't going to be an observational painter, that it was going to be self-contained and so on. But I'm not that rigorously an abstract, minimalist, self-contained painter. Yeah. But having said that, I like to kind of set up a situation that is entirely kind of cold and detached, and then allow the world as observed come in. You know. So yeah, it's a painting I did in 2008, and it's a little bit of a one-off. I did one very large painting, kind of behaving much the same in terms of paint, but it's very, again, like all my stuff is fairly basic, comes from a very basic construction.
Do you mask off those little squares, or do you mask off?
No, I don't. I actually didn't use. I don't use masking tape at all.
Okay.
I didn't in any of these ever. No, but I always use very flat spatulas, knives, scrapers, and you know, kind of awkwardly scrape in and scrape off and tidy up. You know what I mean? So I kind of. And I sort of stay with the same few tools. So it's a fairly simple construct, but it's a bit unusual for me have a horizontal pouring movement going on, which
and so it's painted flat.
That wouldn't have been. It would have. Well, the pouring would have been just all flat and tilting. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
But the rest sort of up fairly upright.
Right.
So,
And do you want to talk about John, or Johnny as you call him, or and his
Yeah.
materials?
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that he was an illustrator.
Yeah, he worked as when we were at the art college, Charlie and I were in fine art and painting, and Johnny was actually in the design school, but he spent all his time up in the painting school, standing around talking, and he did, and so he always had a kind of a more than passing interest in fine arts, because when he was working in design school, studying whatever he was studying there, he was painting in his garage at home, so he was operating between the two, and a lot of the kind of what goes into design came into his painting, and a lot of the thing about Johnny, and it's evident in one of the paintings there, is he thinks really quickly, and his ideas come hot and fast, but he
paints very slowly.
He paints very slowly. That was the problem, and his actual painting activity couldn't keep up with his ideas. So when you look at that big painting down there, it's full of ideas. They're all over the place, but they took 6 months or something to get down. So that was always that dichotomy in his work, with his whole. I suppose it was something that he wrestled with all the time,
But he's got a very astute understanding of painting.
Oh yeah.
He's got very, very bright take on contemporary painting. Right across the board. I've always found conversations with him about my work. You'd imagine that he wouldn't even, understand the language. I'm always very refreshed. I find it very refreshing talking to him about my own work and how he's right in there, even though he's in such a different arena of painting.
Sure, he was right in there from the art school, and he'd be standing at your elbow. And he's supposed to be down in design class. He's standing at your elbow talking.
Commenting on
exactly.
the new running commentary.
What's it like seeing your paintings in different settings? Like you can have them in galleries, museums, or someplace like this, like a hotel, a different context.
Yeah, it's quite a factor actually. It's interesting because when you take something out of the studio and your relationship with the thing changes, and it goes onto a wall, whether it's in a gallery or somebody's home or whatever, and you're almost getting a different view of it. You're getting kind of an objective view of it. It's very hard to articulate it, but somehow your relationship changes with the painting. It's out of your hands. It's out there in the world now, and what actually happens to it, it's no longer within your control. And I remember coming back here for the first time after the paintings had been installed and the place had been opened, and seeing the paintings maybe 3 or 4 years later, perhaps more, and being quite surprised. It was it was a bit of a shock. Oh yeah, I remember that. I did that, and because it's changed. Your relationship to it has changed. You've lost that immediate contact with it. One of the things about painting the way I paint anyway is that sometimes, particularly if you have a difficult time with a painting, and it kind of goes wrong, or you have to leave it alone and you've got to try and re-establish your relationship with it and get back to it again. And I can look at paintings here that were done, whatever it was, 10 or 15 years ago, and remember a really difficult time with that bit. But it's worked out, or it hasn't, which can also happen. So it's that transition between studio and into the public, for want of a better word, the public world, whether, as I say, it's a hotel or a gallery, is it's a factor.
Yeah. I mean, even as a curator, going into the artist studio, and I said to you earlier, when you see the image in the studio, it's very different than when you see it in the gallery. I always feel like, it changes, but there's always feel like there's some sort of loss of. I don't know what it is. Is it the magic of it or the freshness? I don't know. I would struggle with the transition between the two.
Because it's still in the making process. As long as it's in the studio, it's still part of the. Yeah, but it's still part of the making process. It's still new in the world. It's like a newborn baby or something. It's still new in the world. When it gets out about it, that's it.
That's probably the test. Is can it get out of the studio?
Well, there you go.
I think the important thing is I've got a really strong sense of that you're part of the painting and the making of it. You're in it in so many ways, but you have to get out. You have to get out And that is I think that's the measure of the painting. If that you, the artist, you little old wine drinking me, cannot be part of this painting.
Yeah.
The painting has to be an awful lot bigger than me, you know.
Yeah.
And let people in, and also I do really feel that it has something kind of magic has to happen in the making of a painting, whereby, you know, you make a whole series of moves incrementally, building, and then there's a certain point where something happens and it just lifts to a point that you don't particularly have control over, but you have control over getting to that point where that thing might happen, you know. And I think at that point you are put aside, so that I think then a painting can go out and be independent of you and survive.
And it has to have a life of its own. I mean, that's what
totally,
life of its own. It'll be strong enough to stand on its own 2 feet, kind of thing, you know.
Valentine agus níl siad a glí